sins will assume. We'll try to push drugs to keep us all dumbed down and hope that they will never see the truth around. Another promise, another scene, another package lie to keep us trapped in greed. Another green bells wrapped around our minds, an endless red tape to keep the truth confined. They will not force us. They will stop degrading us. They will not control us. We will be victorious.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining. I know I've said this before, but tonight is a very special show. Tonight I am joined by Vangie, Randall-Shortyi. Shout out to Eric Carter Landine. He is wonderful. You may know him from the show. He was on about 2 weeks ago. And he's an incredible person who lost his brother and turned that into advocacy, much like our guest, who I think I just lost. But in any case, I'll keep talking about the unsure what happened there. So I was saying, Eric's story, but he's the one that connected us. And I asked him, I really wanted to talk to someone about missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. And he recommended you, and he's like, she's a badass. And I was like, yes, let's go. And you are, which is amazing. So I definitely wanted to have you on to share your story. So first, let's talk about your son and who he was as a person.
My son is Zachariah Juwan Shorty, and he was, first a son, a grandson, brother, and a partner and a dad. Zach was, as a kid, growing up, he was into sports. Very happy kid, loved by everybody. He was the second grandchild on his dad's side. And so he was very spoiled growing up. And, lots of family support, always a happy kid. When he was in elementary, he loved playing chess. So he was part of a chess club. Very smart kid. And then junior high, he started, joining sports. So he was in Yaffle. He took off there, and I was, his biggest supporter, his biggest fan, and got into high school, and just he started singing, dancing, and just trying to learn different things. Started to, have an interest in tattoos and, things like that. He was also learning to weld and just really, he was a mama's boy, and he liked to dress up. When in high school, he would even wear get so dressed up he'd wear a tuxedo with shirt, his a shirt and tie. And that's when he met his girlfriend, and she thought he was a pastor's son. And just because of how dressy he was, he would wear really nice watches, the rings, the necklaces, the earrings. And um he had two siblings growing up. I had two children from a previous relationship before Zach, and they were all best friends, Christian and Katrina. And they did everything together, played in the backyard. We had, dogs, Rottweilers at the time. So just they spent a lot of time with those dogs, and winter comes, and, they'd use them and as snow dogs, and attach a sleigh, and the dogs would pull them. And it just really close knit between the three of them, and they had a very strong bond.
Yeah, it definitely seems like from the research I did and from Eric's his podcast, it seems like your family has always been so close. Is that typical of people of the Navajo Nation?
Yes, it is. Family is, our strength. Family, is tight knit. I actually live right next door to my mom, and you know, my siblings live with my mom right now. I have a, brother, a sister, and their family who lives with mom, and I live on her property in my own home, of course. But that's something that's important to us.
Absolutely. Now, I know something that really affected Zach was the loss of his older brother, Christian. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yes. So my firstborn Christian, um, like I said earlier, they were very close, and Christian was 22 years old, two children, and one day he was with the mother of his child, and um, it was a typical day. It was snowing. We were, conversating through phone calls that day. And I remember being out and about, looking for furniture. And um, Christian called me and said that he had to take his girlfriend to work. And I told him to be careful. Um, it was in December 14, and um, I didn't realize that he had been drinking. And so they traveled out to take her to work, and the gas was low. They stopped at on top of the hill. They call it Hilltop. It's a speedway. And the machines weren't working. The ATM machines weren't working. Neither were the gas pumps. So with them being low on gas, they had to travel back into Bloomfield. And Christian was driving. He was drinking and driving, and kept going, swerving off the road. And eventually he hit the guardrail. Christian wasn't wearing his seatbelt, and he was ejected from the car, and he died at the scene. And I got the phone call from his girlfriend's mom saying that the kids were in an accident, and I dropped everything. It was about 3 p.m. We had just gotten home, and we were chopping wood, getting, trying to get our home warmed up. And I just remember screaming, the kids were in an accident, let's go. And their dad and Zach jumped in the truck, and we were en route to San Juan Regional Hospital because that's where I thought that they were. And we get there, and just before we got there, I get another phone call and saying that Christian was gone, and I just screamed. I just remember screaming, my son, my son. And we get to the hospital, and I get in there, and I'm like, where's my son? Where's my son? My son was in an accident. And everybody was just like, okay, what's going on? Who's your kid? And my son didn't make it to the hospital. His girlfriend did. She was okay. And her little boy did. But Christian was still at the scene, and, it clicked in my mind. Okay, they're still investigating. And so I just knew it was outside of Bloomfield is all I knew. So we took off, and we came upon the scene. I jumped out and saw Christian there, and not realizing that Zach had jumped out as well. And so Zach saw his brother, in the body bag at the scene of the accident. So, that itself, I know that it caused a lot of trauma, and Zach was young, and he shouldn't have gotten out of the vehicle, and he shouldn't have seen his brother like that.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. And, losing one son, I can't even fathom. And then now we are here to talk about Zach. First of all, I want to give people a heads up. You're in New Mexico. Santa
Yeah.
Fe is like my favorite place in the world, by the way. But anyway, so you're there. You are part of the Navajo Nation. And one thing that I saw in your story as I was reading is I learned a lot about the way that things work as far as jurisdictions. So, and I do want to give a trigger warning to people watching in case you didn't see the description. For some reason, YouTube makes me say unalived instead of the M word, or they're going to take the show down. That's how they are. But this is going to deal with depression and unaliving and things like that. So just a heads up. But now you have lost a second son, and that was in 2020. And
Yeah.
through my research, I saw that there is so many issues between jurisdiction and indigenous communities because of how the basic, I don't know, I was looking into this, and it's astounding because the police and people like that do not have people overseeing them in the Navajo area. Is that true?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Sadly,
Incredible.
yes. Yeah.
So why don't
Yeah.
we start by sharing, a little bit of what happened to Zach. I know. Well, first I want to say that Zach has, if you guys listen to Eric's podcast, you will hear some of his music, and it is awesome. And you
Thank
were
you.
so supportive of his music, which I love so much. And you were supportive of his ink, and you got some by him, which is also amazing. But he was very affected by his brother's death, and it started taking its toll on him. But I will say, you were like the coolest mom. Like, he would call and be like, I need help, and you're like, when and where?
Yes.
And you were always that person for him and his friends, which was amazing. So can you share a little bit about that? Like, why why you think you were so close to him, and why you felt it was so important to be there for him all the time, including his friends. Anytime he asked you for anything, you were like, "Yep, let's go."
Yeah. So I was close with Zach, from the minute he was born. He was mine. He was my baby. And nobody I was a preschool teacher so that I could be with my children, and still be able to work and bring in some income. So I, was in the classroom with them, and up until they became, you know, when they turned 5 and they were in kindergarten, and I was still next door to them, and they'd come, after school to the daycare and stuff. So we were very close, and the only other person that would watch Zach was his paternal grandmother, his dad's mom. And when Christian had passed away, well, actually, it was just before Christian passed away as well. They got into some trouble. They both did a year. Zach was, in juvie, and um, I did what I could, to keep them out of trouble. And it seemed like the trouble occurred only when they were at school, when they were not, when I wasn't there. And so we did the whole counseling, things like that, traveled, for all sorts of tests, because I was like, okay, what's going on? But after Christian had passed away, Zach really turned to alcohol and drugs. And there was even a point where his dad had gotten involved, and they made the front page news, sadly. And, I knew Zach was using, but his dad, I did not. And he did use prior, like years before, and, stopped, and he made his life right again. And, but, to find out that he and, Zach were doing it together was a shock. After Christian passed, I worked a lot. And, Zach's dad had kidney failure. So, in and out of the hospital, and dialysis and things like that. So I was, just dealing with all of that. And when I lost Christian, I felt like I became more overprotective of Zach. I did not want to lose another child. I have 3. My daughter, she had moved on. She was in her relationship. She had her kid, and she was still, she was drinking, but she was safe. But Zach, on the other hand, like, he would leave and go out with his friends, and I would get this feeling, or this, the mom's instinct, and so I'd call him, and I would call him, ask him, where are you at? Who are you with? You'd better not be, getting into any trouble. Like, I can't deal with any of this, because he was in and out of jail at times, and having to, take care of his dad at the same time. And so, it was really hard. It was very hard. And, there's times that he wouldn't answer. So I would tell him, I'm going to keep harassing you until you respond. And so he learned, he learned, because one day I actually went from house to house looking for him, because he wasn't answering. And I actually did find him and located him. And he was like, "What the hell, Mom?" I was like, "Well, don't mess with me, because I'm gonna, your mom is the best detective." And yeah. And so, just, I honestly didn't want to lose another kid. And, like I said, I did everything I could to save him. And in the end, I still lost him.
So, as far as Zach, as far as him being unalived, there, and like I said, it was July 25th, 2020, so it's still somewhat recent. But can you explain how that day went for people who don't know the story?
So prior to that day, Zach, yes, he was an adult, and people may say that I was enabling him, but I wanted to make sure my kid was safe. My adult child was safe, and conflict between his dad and him and Zach, and Zach was into music and tattooing. He would do that at the house, and I knew that he was doing drugs, and I told him, you can't do that shit here. That is, you can't do that. And he would do that elsewhere, but he'd come home, high, and come home drunk. And so I would, it was many sleepless nights, because on top of all of that, he was suicidal. And so, like, gosh, I had to learn to listen and be very in tune to where, like, with him being on high on meth, he was a different person. Sometimes he was a monster, and I had to deal with that. And because you just never know who you're talking to and who you're going to get. And so, I still had my boundaries to where, I was still safe and I was okay. And many people don't understand that unless you go through it. And people can judge me, but, like, I don't care, I don't care. Unless you've gone through it, you don't know. But I had to learn to tune out everything else, like the TV, the music, and listen to him and make sure that he was okay. And prior to Zach, prior to his death, 1 month before, Zach hung himself. Zach followed through and he hung himself. And, it was after I had gone to sleep. And I just remember him waking me up in the middle of the night, just very, very upset. And he just asked, Mom, did you take me down? Did you cut the belt? And I'm like, trying to wake up, like, what are you talking about? And he says, I hung myself. And, I woke up and I'm like, somebody laid him down and put his head on the punching bag that was there, because that's what he used. He took the punching bag off and he hung himself from there. And I said, no. And his dad heard him and came in the room, and he says, what's going on? And he, asked his dad, did you cut the belt? And he says, no, what are you talking about? And the next day, and Zach was on probation at the time. And so the next day I called his probation officer and I said, I need help. Zach needs help. And it took a while. They had talked him into going to San Juan Regional, and he walked out once or twice. The security guard talked him into going back in, which he did. And then they finally, got him to the back, locked him up in that room, did their evaluation, and flew him to Albuquerque. And he was there for a week for evaluation. And sadly, all it took was for him to say, I'm okay. And he was released. And I knew he wasn't okay. And I tried to tell him. I contacted his probation officer and said, he needs an ankle bracelet. He needs a DPS. He needs an alcohol drug monitor. She says, yes, I'll get those on him. Just bring him as soon as he gets released, bring him here to Aztec. And I did that. He walked out with no ankle monitors at all. And so a month later, he went out with some friends, and that was a Monday night, and he was working on some music, and I picked him up like the early hours, and he wanted to bring a friend home with him, a female friend, who was the person that provided, like, who knew where to get the drugs, and it was there. It was easy for him to have access to, and he wanted to bring her home. I said, no, no, you guys are under the influence, and I don't want to deal with you all fighting. I have to be at work. And he says, well, can you just drop us off? I said, okay. So we dropped him off at her relative's place in Farmington. And I went home, got a couple of hours of sleep. This was Tuesday morning. Tuesday morning, Zach calls me as I'm getting ready for work, and he says, Mom, can you pick me up? I said, okay. Are you coming home? He says, yes. And then he says, can my friend come with me? I said, no. Your dad's in dialysis. I'm going to be at work. No. And then, he says, let me call you back. So they had made other plans, and he called me again, asked to be picked up and dropped off at the Journey Inn, which is below the Farmington police station and about 5 minutes from where I work. So it's on my way to work. And I picked them up, dropped them both off there. He had court, and this was during COVID. So it was through Zoom. And I had reminded him, he went by the name of Juwan, which is his middle name. So, I called him, hey, Juwan, don't forget you have court. Let me know how it goes. And, we were conversating throughout the day, just as we always do. And then all of a sudden, the conversation stopped. And then he called me from a different phone number, which was to one of his guy friends there at the room. And he says, Mom, my battery died. Do you have a charger? I said, yes. So I dropped everything and I took the charger to him and made sure he went back into the hotel room. And then I went back to work. Prior to that, I told him, I get off at 6. And of course, it always ended with the I love yous and, be careful. But I went back to work, and 6 o'clock came. I tried calling him. He didn't answer. I figured he was, in the middle of his music session. And so the Journey Inn was on my route home. I drove by, just glanced over there, didn't see him anywhere. And I went home to Kirtland. I didn't even go inside. I stayed outside on the back porch and was cleaning it up. And then about 7-ish, Zach called me and he says, Mom, we're hungry. Can you bring us some pizza? I said, sure. And again, dropped everything, went into Farmington, went to Little Caesars, got pizza. And he calls me and he says, can you pick up my friend? She's over at the Encore. And I said, I thought she was with you. And so he says, no, she left. I said, okay, we'll tell her to be ready. I picked her up and took her back to the Journey Inn with where Zach, I pulled up and Zach was outside on the phone. And it looked like a really intense conversation. We both got out of the car and she looked at Zach like, well, we both got out of the car and I heard the conversation from Zach when he was on the phone, and it was the mother of his child. And he was telling her, I love you. begging her to work things out. And so my passenger, his female friend, um, heard that conversation and looked at him like, what the fuck, because she also is thinking that, she's in that relationship, and, they had their little flings, and which was very temporary. And he told her, take the pizza inside. So I was out there with him, and he says, Mom, help me. Can you talk to her? Can you talk to her? He hands me the phone. So I told the mother of his child, he's upset right now. I'll talk to him, and I'll call you back. And he as he was begging her, he was telling her, marry me or bury me. Those were his words. And I told him, Juan, you know what you need to do. You need to sober up. You need to get yourself clean so that you can be the person that she needs you to be, and that you can be a dad to your little girl. And he says, I know, Mom, I know, I will, I will, I got this, He says, let me just finish this track. And he says, I'll call you. And I said, okay. I said, be careful. I love you. And I left.
The girl, I know that you, like I said, you did everything for his friends. His friends were your friends in that way.
His friends were like my kids too. That's how I felt. I looked out for them, and there were times that they didn't have a place to stay. And so my home was a safe place for them. There was times that they got kicked out, and they knew that they had a safe place to be. And I told them, no drugs, no alcohol. They would, have food. I provided meals. And I just, all I asked is that they clean up their mess, do some yard work, and, behave themselves. And that's what I would, tell them. And, like I said, they were like my kids as well. And, I just prayed and hoped that if the shoe was on the other foot, and that, Zach was ever in trouble, that they would have his back. But apparently they didn't.
Well, the girl that you gave the ride to and stuff, you had a bad feeling about her. And like I said, you liked all his friends, but she rubbed you the wrong way. What was it about her that stood out?
So I got home one day, and this is the first time I met her. And I get home one day, and Zach was already home. He was already home. And so I go down to the room because he didn't come out. Usually he comes out to the kitchen, and he's like, hey, Mom, what are we making for dinner? Because food was his thing. Like, he loved food. And so I went to the room, and on his futon, he's sitting on the futon, and this girl is sitting right next to him. And so that, I didn't like that. And because he was already in a relationship as well, he had this baby. And so, and he says, hey, Mom, this is my friend. And I said, well, for a friend, she's sitting too close to you, get the fuck on the other side, I was very blunt. And she just, kind of looked at me. And so I said, I'm serious, if you're just his friend, why are you sitting that close? There's plenty of room on that couch. And then I turned around and walked away, and Zach came after me, and he says, what the hell, Mom? Well, where did that come from? I said, you have a daughter and you have her mom. Where do they stand in this? I'm not gonna have you play these games. What's going on? And he says, I'm sorry, mom, just, and I said, well, you better do something about her and get her out of my house. So she got picked up. And so she was always this temporary person. And Zach was doing, he was doing his best to get clean. He would be clean for a, week, 2 weeks, and then she would pop up. And then there went his sobriety. And so that's why I had, issues with this girl.
Yeah, and it turns out she definitely was involved the day that things went down, to the extent I don't know, but she was definitely involved in everything that transpired. Can you share what happened that day after you dropped off the pizzas and the drinks and everything, and you said goodbye to him? What then happened?
So I went home, and usually he calls me. He didn't call me, and I did attempt, no answer. Again, like I said, I thought he was in his session, so I went to bed, and I believe, gosh, I believe it was about 11ish, maybe 10:30, 11 o'clock. I get a phone call from this girl, from that girl, and she's calling me from through Facebook Messenger, and she says Zach stepped out and hasn't come back in the room. And I said, what the hell, where is he? Can you look for him? I said, and call me right back. And so we hung up the phone, and then I dialed Zach's phone number, and he didn't answer. She did. And that was it was a huge red flag to me. I said, is he back? And she says, no, his phone kept falling out of his pocket. So, I have his phone, and Zach has deep pockets. I mean, where a pint can fit in that pocket. And, you can't really see it when he's standing, unless he's sitting. And that's a good size. But, so I woke his dad up, and I said, Zach didn't get back into the room. I don't know where he's at. I said, we need to go. And we took separate vehicles. I told the girl, stay where you're at, because I'm going to pick you up. And I met her right outside the hotel room, and we started looking around. I asked her, is he back? She says, no. We're just driving around the neighborhood in circles. There was a park. We got out, walked the park, calling out his name. And I kept her close because she was one of the last persons with him. I was racing from Farmington to Kirtland back home and checking along those highways to see if he was walking. I don't know how many trips I did throughout that night, just racing back and forth, and then back into Farmington, and back to the hotel, and nothing. We were walking 2 a.m. just asking people, that were still out, have you seen Zach? And just yelling for his name. I finally got home at 5 a.m. On Wednesday morning, and I stayed home, and she stayed there at the house with me. And I told her, start calling everybody, and I put out a Facebook post, asking if anybody had seen my baby boy. I stayed home while his dad continued searching, because I was, waiting for him to come walking through those doors. He never came home. And then Wednesday night, we switched out. His dad stayed home while she and I went out looking again. Thursday morning, his dad went to dialysis. And I remember sitting at the dining room table, staring out the window, and I was, crying and just like, what am I going to do? What do I do now? And I had called the police department and made a missing persons report. And I just, remember breaking down and, asking them, why are you asking me these questions? And I think what got me was, just having to describe every detail, tattoos and the color of his eyes, the color of his hair, dental records, they wanted all of that. And I was like, why, and we continued searching. It didn't stop. By Friday, we had put out a search team, and that was just, with mainly my family and some of, Zach's friends and his teachers from Rosanate, where he graduated from. And we were looking everywhere through the brushes along the river until a family member stopped me and asked me, are we looking for Zach or are we looking for a body? And that stopped me in my tracks. And I said, we're looking for Zach. And he says, why are we looking through these bushes then? So we got back along the roads, going down the streets, searching. And then Saturday, we went out to the reservation, to Navajo reservation, and we started searching in those different communities, which is right outside of Kirtland, because Kirtland and Farmington's border town. And that was Saturday, and I had gotten rid of that girl Friday. I was done with her by Friday. And so Saturday, as we were searching, I get this message through my Facebook Messenger from her, asking for help. And she says, help, they kidnapped me. They're going to hurt me. They don't want me to say nothing. And I'm like, who, where? She did and I said, why do you have your phone if they kidnapped you? And I felt like she was trying to set me up. So she dropped her pin location, and my family and I had, all met at one area, and we, decided that we were going to head her direction, wait down the street and call Farmington PD, which we did. And we told the officer, like, from the moment Zach went missing and how we were searching and how she was one of the last persons and now she's claiming to be kidnapped. So the officer, starts to drive down the street and sees her and her friend walking down the street and stops them and asks her, are you okay? Are you in danger? She says, I'm fine. I'm okay. I'm not in any danger. And so the female friend that she was with gets arrested because she had an arrest warrant. Her boyfriend is watching from the side, from the street, and he's really upset because, his girlfriend just got arrested. So he's taking pictures of our license plates and everything and whatnot. And I'm like, like, crap, like, because you just never know, you never know who's involved. And so they let that girl go as well, because there was no motives and, she was safe, everything. And that was the last time that I had seen her. And so that was Saturday. And Sunday, I needed to rest, but his dad continued searching with some of his friends, and they had ATVs. They were, going up along the bluffs and whatnot. It was Sunday that it was the first, call I got was word of mouth that actually it was Saturday, that it was word of mouth that, Zach was found. And I said, no, he has not been found. I got really I remember getting very defensive. I said, no, he has not been found. We are still out here searching. And so she caught herself and she stopped. And when I think back now, I know that she knew something because her mom worked at the hospital. So that was Saturday. Sunday, it was word of mouth that, a body was found. And again, I was in denial, but there was no other information with it. Tuesday, yes, it was Monday. And so actually, no, I did get information on Monday and also a name, and it was to OMI, which is the Office of Medical Investigation, I think, OMI in Albuquerque. So I called and I asked them, do you have a body that fits the description? And she said, yes, I do, but I can't confirm until I run fingerprints. And I'm like, are you sure? I can come to Albuquerque. I'm only 3 hours away. I can come and I can, identify him if I need to. And she says, no, stay where you're at. I was with his dad at the time, and I was like, what are we gonna do? Like the Farmington PD, they had just closed. So I started knocking on their doors, and eventually somebody in the back opened it. And I, tell them, my Zach, do you know what happened to him? This is what I'm told, help me. Somebody help me. I need answers. And they tell me, just wait across in the parking lot. We'll come out to you. And just the waiting, it felt like forever. And Zach's dad is leaning out of the car puking from the news we just got. And I'm trying to console him and keep my shit together, and Navajo Nation Fire Department, one of the firefighters drove by and seen us. And so he stopped and he asked, are you guys okay? I said, no, I'm trying to look for my baby and I don't have answers. And he says, Hita, wait here, let me make some phone calls. He goes to the far corner away from me as like of the parking lot. And I knew he knew. And he comes back and he says, come back in the morning. The detective is going to talk to you. And I said, okay. We go home and I'm just waiting, and I cried myself to sleep. And Zach's dad left, and he comes back and he was so angry, and he wakes me up, and it was, the blaming started, and I was sitting on the bed and I hear my phone buzzing, and I look at it and I'm getting these ransom text messages, that my son is still alive and they want money. And I'm like, and I show his dad, and I'm like, okay, we got to go find an officer. We can't call this in because they could be listening on the scanner. And so we're driving around like 2 a.m. trying to find an officer. We finally found one, showed the messages, and then he directs us back to Farmington. So we go back into Farmington, show the officer the messages. And again, he says, come back in the morning. The detective will talk to you. I said, okay. And so I go home. The next morning, those ransom messages start again. I'm at the sheriff's department or at the Farmington PD at 8 a.m. with my family. One family member got interviewed, and that's the person that gave me the information for OMI, that Zach's body was found. But he was interviewed first, and then I was next. And I had to share what had happened from the last moment that I saw Zach up until that moment I sat there. Meanwhile, my phone is buzzing in the center of the table. And I'm like, are you guys going to look into that? And they said no. And I'm, sitting there puzzled, not putting the pieces together, and, I remember Navajo Nation PD, criminal investigators sitting there, the drug task force on one side, FBI on the other side, and I was the one interviewed, and, and I'm like, okay, what's going on, like, and they wouldn't tell me. They would not tell me. They knew, but they would not tell me. They asked me for my phone and I gave it to them. They said, we'll be in contact with you at the end of the day. I went home with no answers, and 5 p.m. FBI victims advocate, they come knocking on my door. They bring my phone back to me and they inform me that Zach was gone and couldn't give me any answers as to how or where, they had found him. Nothing, nothing at all. They said it's an open investigation. We will be in contact. Please keep this to yourself. And I'm like, and I'm like, and in my mind, I thought maybe he took his own life and they found him somewhere. And they left and I sat there and I'm like, what are we going to do? We can't tell anybody. And so we went to bed Tuesday night, 1 week later, not telling a soul. So I was informed on Tuesday, and yet Zach's body was found on Saturday. And he was, classified as a John Doe. And when I made the missing persons report, he was supposed to have been put in the system on and off the reservation as an endangered missing person. And that didn't happen. We went to bed without telling a soul. Wednesday morning, we get up and I'm like, we got to tell somebody. What are we going to tell? What are we going to tell our family? And my worst part was having to tell Zach's grandparents, his paternal grandparents. And so our first family meeting was with Zach's paternal side. And then we went down to my mom's and informed them. And couldn't plan nothing until his body was brought back.
So you never found out, they never found out who sent the ransom text or anything like that.
No,
This is conjecture, but do you think it was that girl?
I have no idea. I have no idea. And at one point I did conversate with the guy. I answered the phone because he was calling me, and it was a man. And like he was even asking for gift cards too, and like $7,000. And I'm like, where do I take it? And I was trying to stall him until I got to the police department, but they didn't care, because they already knew he was gone.
Do you, looking back, do you wish you would have known as soon as you reported him missing, or are you glad that you still had those additional days of hope that maybe he would come home?
I wish I had known, when I look back, I had no idea that I could have made that missing persons report that same night.
Yeah.
And, I waited. So that was Tuesday night. I waited till Thursday morning to make that report. And I wish that I had, you know, gone inside that hotel room that night. When I think back to it, I feel like I was set up as well. They took Zach, and I had that girl with me, and I believe that she was a distraction, and we were just in that area driving around looking for Zach. And when I think back also, she was on the phone a lot. So who knows who she was conversating with and what the conversations were. And during the funeral planning, when we were planning Zach's funeral, she came back. She came to my house, got dropped off, and I had no idea who it was. And I stepped out and onto my porch, and she just dropped down to the ground and was just immediately just started saying, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And I told her, you stay there, stay where you're at. And I said, "What the fuck are you doing here? What do you want?" And all she kept saying was, "I'm sorry." And I just told her, "Stay there." And it was a weekend, it was a Saturday. And I was trying to call, the investigator to let them know that she was there. I finally got through, and they didn't come to my house. They asked me to take her to them. Yes. So I had to sit in the car with her and drive her 20 minutes to the Farmington Police Department where the investigator met us. I dropped her off there and I left. And it wasn't only her that I did that with. It was another female that was also in that hotel room that night, because there was a total of 2 males, 2 females, and Zach in that room. And so both females, I had to take them to the Farmington Police Department to be questioned.
And did anything ever come from that?
Obviously not, because we're on 5 years, and I'm still waiting.
Yeah. What do you think she meant by "I'm sorry"?
I think that she had a part to do in it. From the other witnesses in the room, there was an altercation, a verbal and physical altercation between Zach and her, where he pushed her. And so they said they had taken Zach out to calm down. And while he was out there, she had made a phone call to someone and put the green light on Zach. And that was part of her conversation.
Wow. I know at one point, Zach was talking about working with the police and giving them info on some other people. Can you kind of explain that, and if you think maybe that also contributed to his death?
Yes. So when he got the drug charges, he and his dad, just the whole thing, they were being surveillanced by the Region 2 Narcotics Task Force here in Farmington. And like I said, I worked a lot. So while I'm at work, I had no idea what they were doing. I get home, they're home, and then we're like, we're, I guess, a family, we're home. I start cooking, tending to my yard, things like that. But meanwhile, they were being surveillanced, and one day they both get picked up, Zach and his dad. That was the first time they get picked up, and they were taken to the substation by the sheriff's department in Kirtland with the San Juan County, San Juan County Sheriff's Department. And the way Zach had described it, he said, it was just something that you see like in a movie. They were wearing the black mask, the face mask, so you couldn't see who was questioning them. And so Zach was scared, he was scared. And they continued, they let them go. They actually took them back home, and they continued to surveillance them. I was at work one day, and Zach calls me. He says, "Mom, they're at the door." I said, "Who?" He says, "Region 2. If I don't go out there, they're going to break the door down." I said, "You better open that door, Joanne. Open the door. I'm on my way home." And I'm rushing home, and they immediately took him. They took him to the detention center, and there was still a couple of cars there. They couldn't enter my property, or they got off my property, but they were driving around the fence area up and down the road looking for something. And so I got inside the yard and was watching them for a little bit, and then I walked up to them, and I asked them, "What are you guys looking at? What are you guys looking for?" They didn't respond, and they got in their vehicles and they left, and they drove down the road by the highway. They all parked there, had their little meeting, and then then they left. Meanwhile, I guess the whole time they were looking for Zach's phone and his ID. I found his ID, but not his phone, and it's strange how that just disappeared. And but he ended up, after those charges, he ended up working for the Region 2. What is that word that I'm looking for? The Region 2 narcotics. No. His work with them. But he ended up working with them. And so I begged him, not to. I said, we can get an attorney, Juwan. I can get an attorney. He says, "No, Mom, this is my mess." And so he says, "I have to meet with them." He says, Can you take me to Farmington?" The first time we met, I took him to Walmart, and we met in the parking lot. And he says, "Mom, I want you to sit right here and wait. I'm going to get in that car." He says, do you see that car in front of us?" He says, "I'm going to walk to that car. I'm going to get in." He says, "Just sit here and wait until I'm done." I sat there and waited and just prayed and prayed and prayed. And I was, like, "Juwan, don't do this," And so they took him to the Journey Inn. He hung out there for a little bit. Nothing, there was nobody there. And then the officer brought him back, and he walked back to me. And then the second time, again, I had to take him to Farmington, and same spot, Walmart. And then they went to the Coronado Apartments in Farmington. And Zach went up into one of the apartments where they were hanging out, like, I guess the dealers, the big time dealers. And Zach was messaging the officer downstairs, like, "Hey, they're here." And they gave Zach a needle. Zach said he went into the bathroom and stuck the needle in his sock. He stuck it in his sock. He didn't use it. And he got out of there. He told him, "Hey, I gotta go." And he said he walked out, got in the car, and he was patted down by the officer. Strangely, the officer patted him this time, but didn't pat him down the last time. So he was patted down, and the officer found the needle, and that upset him. And he said, "This, we're done. This is off. We're done." And meanwhile, Juwan is like, "What the fuck? They're all up there. Aren't you going to do something about it?" He's like, "I didn't even use this needle. It's still full." And he was brought back to Walmart, and he was really upset. He was like, and he was just upset, and afraid as well, because I don't know if he was threatened by the officer also. I that part I don't know. And after that, he stayed home. He stayed home, and so for him to go to the Journey Inn in July was like was surprising to me that he would have even done that.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. It is, could there be justice at this point? And if so, what would it look like?
I think there could still be justice. The person's responsible for his death. There's more than one person. I know so, because Zach is a fighter. Zach isn't some little bitch that one person can take. Zach would have done anything to come home, to call me, and for a few guys to get him into that vehicle and to take him to where he was killed. I still believe that there is justice. I still believe it. I have faith. I have faith, and I know that, in ways that Zach is guiding me. I've done a lot of the investigating myself. I get tips and I follow up on those tips. And I also notify the FBI on those.
How can people help to get justice for Zach? Or is there somewhere they can reach out to you? Or, if they do have any information, but also like, even if they say, "Hey, I want to put pictures up. I live in New Mexico. I want to, start a group." Anything like that. Where is there a website people can go to, or where's the best way?
Yes, they can get on the FBI website and download his flyer. There is a $10,000 reward right now for information leading to the arrest of the individuals involved. They can also, email me or follow my page and download the flyer there as well. Sharing my post. I have a Facebook page for Zach only, so it's Justice for Zachariah, and My Mom is My Voice. I also have a TikTok page for just Zach as well. So, just sharing and sending those tips to the FBI. And the FBI's phone number is 505-889-1300. And, we're on our third FBI agent right now with these 5 years. And I truly believe the first one sat on the case. The second one wasn't there very long, and this third one, I believe he's working it, and it's nice to have contact with him and to be able, on my days that I'm frustrated, and I tell him, what, I'm frustrated today. What's going on? Do you have updates for me? And I'm able to get a response. So, those little things matter to me.
Absolutely. And what can people also do for, Navajo Nation or Indigenous peoples as a whole? How can we help? How can we spread the word that, missing and murdered Indigenous peoples is a thing? They go ignored, and they are targeted and they are ignored. What can we do, especially as white people?
sharing the flyers. We have our rallies. I know that you all are in different states, but just sharing those rallies, or sharing the flyers. And if you're in the area, attend the rally, attend a march, because we are doing them all over. And I am also now an advocacy coordinator with the Missing and Murdered Diné Relatives Coalition, which is a nonprofit organization. And me being an impacted family member, I know what these families are going through. And I can honestly say that we help families. We help families. We are boots on the ground. I am attending candlelight vigils. I'm attending, marches and rallies. I'm going to conferences. I've even, gone and assisted on search and rescues. I've even, provided the food on behalf of the nonprofit organization. So, if you all want to donate to the Missing and Murdered Diné Relatives Coalition, because we do help our families. And, I've been out there advocating, tabling, and attending these parades on the Navajo Nation to bring awareness, not only for my son's case, but, letting families know that we are an organization that is here to support you.
Absolutely. Well, I cannot thank you enough for joining me tonight, and I hope we keep in touch. And you are welcome anytime.
Thank you.
I will spread Zachariah's story as far as could be. So please, guys, share this episode. Also, share this information. Tell Zachariah's story. Make sure people know it, because that is how we are going to catch the people who have done this to him and his family. There needs to be some semblance of justice.
Yes. And if you all would get on the gunmemorial.org and search Zachariah Randall-Shortyi's name, you'll find his little profile, and you can scroll down and you can light a candle for him. I visit that site every single day, and every day I am lighting a candle for Zach. So, we can only light the candle once a day, but, it can be done daily. And just, share his flyers, share my post. It just takes one click of a button. Zach's birthday is, I forgot to mention that. Do we have time?
Yeah,
Zach,
of course.
okay, Zach's birthday is May 5th. And May 5th is also a national day of, for the missing and murdered Indigenous, women relatives. And so every year on May 5th here in Farmington, I'm hosting an event, to where I share the platform with families where they can share their stories. And it's been getting bigger. We've had informational booths so that families, have those resources as well. And next year, I'm hoping it's been outdoors. Next year, I'm hoping to get it indoors, so it's more of a conference setting. So, that is something I do every single year now because of Zach.
That's amazing. Well, again, I cannot thank you enough.
Yes.
Everyone, please like and subscribe. That is the only thing that keeps this show going. And please reach out if you have any questions about Zach, or you want help or anything, and there's anything I can do, please reach out as well. Thank you again so much. Rest in power, Zachariah. We are with you. And as always, free Palestine, free Temujin Kensu, and also fuck ICE. No illegal people on stolen land. So thank you again so much. And thank you all so much for watching. Until next time, much love.
and subscribe and follow Zachariah on his YouTube channel. That YouTube channel, that was his way of expressing the loss of his brother and his addictions to the drugs and alcohol. And you can find him under Isolated, ISOL number 8 ED.
Awesome.
Thank you.